In the programme of Robin Hood and the Babes in the Wood, I think there are some quite heavy marketing strategies used in terms of the adverts that are used. For example, the fact that most of the programme is in black and white in terms of the actual information about the production, but then throughout there are all these really bright coloured adverts. And especially the fact that the adverts are at the beginning of the programme and at the end of the programme, so you've got this really bright coloured sandwich, and it really draws your attention to all the adverts that are used throughout the programme. I think another marketing strategy that has been used is within the programme there's quite a lot of activities and colouring, and it's quite child aimed. From the front cover, which is a cartoon, to the maze that's on the third page of the actual programme once you get past the initial adverts. It's all sort of aimed at children, but then in the programme there is a semi sort of synopsis, and it says "Into the Woods" at the top, and it looks like it's going to be a little story that children could read about the production. However, it seems to be the actual story of Into the Woods, which is really quite a complicated story. And it is using quite complex language, and it is actually really something that adults would need to be involved in, and I feel like this potentially is another marketing strategy that has been used to then get adults involved within the programme. For example, a child flicking through the programme, looking at all the colouring, going to the story. Oh, I want to read the story. Seeing all the images of the mushrooms and the two characters on the story page. Really wanting to read this story, but not being able to read the language. The writing's really small. Not really understanding it. Having to get their parent or grandparent or guardian, whoever they're with, to read the story with them. It then gets the guardian involved in the programme. The guardian then picks up the programme, is flicking through the programme. They then get to the adverts. Potentially, they start looking at the adverts in the programme. This is potentially another marketing strategy to get people to start looking at the adverts within the programme. Another thing they've used at the beginning of the programme, big cartoon on the front cover, and then you turn the page, and Disney adverts on the second page. That's another thing children seeing. It's another sort of marketing advert. It gets children looking at the programme, it gets adults then involved, children see it, they get their parents to look at oh look, it's the Lion King, oh look, it's Finding Nemo. It gets the adults looking at the programme, and then I think it's more marketing strategies to get the adults diving in, so I think it's more the way that the programme's laid out in terms of the way the adverts are compiled is also a marketing strategy. John O'Brien wrote, quote, "Pantomime's various elements were often not unified by any overarching design, nor were they necessarily linked one to the next by any recognisable principle of narrative logic. But this does not seem to have bothered audiences much, as there is a testimony that theatregoers enjoyed this mixture of spectacle and sensation. Quote, "This was in the 1700s, and I don't think this mixture of spectacle and sensation in pantomime has really changed much. I think this is clear from the programmes. I think we can see in how long the programme actually is and how detailed it actually is." Looking at where O'Brien says, quote, "Pantomime's various elements were not unified by any overarching design," quote, I would like to link that to this programme where it jumps around between adverts for completely random items and businesses, and then on the next page there is games and activities for children, information about the pantomime and the Northcote Theatre. I know that what O'Brien is saying is about pantomime performance and the style of pantomime performance, and the way that it was more unscripted back in the 1700s, but I think in a way the unscripted and unstyled design of pantomime carries forward to today, and I think that's what we see in this particular programme today. However, in a writing by Caroline Radcliffe, she writes, quote, "David Mayer proposes that the fantasy of pantomime is a mechanism for dealing indirectly with disguised anxieties." Quote, "Is this in the programme through maybe the cartoonish layout of pictures, or maybe the emphasis on trying to connect the families, or maybe the adverts? This emphasis of trying to almost escape reality through pantomime, I think you could say, does continue within the programme. And I think linking to the other point, we could maybe say that this would make the programme a really vital part of the pantomime experience. And going off that, say that maybe pantomime is actually a stylised experience, and perhaps that is shown in the programmes. Going on from that, maybe pantomime does actually have a design, and if pantomime truly is a mechanism for dealing with anxieties in the real world, is that its design, and the way it's unscripted and the way it was originated and the dancing and the songs and the way it has progressed to now and the way the programmes are laid out with the colouring in them and the cartoons and the advert for perfumes, businesses, and then Cadbury World thrown in there to get people to look at those and think about those and think, oh, I want to go there, oh, maybe I'll buy that. Things that have absolutely nothing to do with the pantomime, and things that maybe they wouldn't look at if they were at home. Are they a distraction from the anxieties of the real world? Is that the design of the pantomime? No, we can't know for sure that that is real. This is simply a question that we can put out there. We'll never know, and pantomime is probably designed simply for fun, but that's just a fun thing to ask. And yeah, but it's a fun thing to think about. Was pantomime actually designed specifically for us to get away from everything? And especially now we have it mainly at Christmas, with everything that goes on at Christmas and how busy everyone is. Is it really sort of continuing with that design for us to just stop thinking about the real world? It's just an interesting point to look at based on the way programmes look now.
Unlike Robin Hood and the Babes in the Wood, Bent seems to contrast this goal of tying in marketing strategies relating to the content of the performance. For instance, a visual dichotomy occurs at the very start of the programme. The front cover brandishes a red swastika. Turn the page and suddenly there is a grand chandelier sporting an advertisement for a nearby lighting show. Another example of this conflict is the advert for a hotel, which has the phrase beautiful bed covers plastered in a large font on one side of the page, when it is just preceded on another page a timeline of events leading to the Nazi persecution of homosexuals. This, of course, prompted the question of our presentation. How does this work to impact the audience's perspective of the performance? To discover the intention to include adverts within this dark program, I researched the public opinion of Martin Sherman's Bent. Unfortunately, I couldn't establish a clear British perspective, yet I did find multiple American secondary resources, first of which is simply another format in advertising a different performance of Bent. As you can see in this image at the bottom of the poster, or what could possibly be a leaflet, the text says controversial subject matter, discretion advised. The fact that this is in America does lower the value of what the Northcott's audience perspective could have been about the performance. However, in terms of when this performance of Bent was performed, it is 2 years ahead of the Northcott performance. Thus, there could be some correspondence between the two performances in the sense that they both believe Bent to be a controversial play. Furthermore, we should ask why it might be considered controversial to both the English and American cultures. A prominent factor to question is what the opinion of homosexuals were during the 80s. Unfortunately, most likely a negative one, as during the 80s the outbreak of AIDS had occurred, provoking more of the Western population to further discriminate against homosexuals. Therefore, we can surmise that the Northcott audience would probably consider the performance to be highly controversial due to the negative connotations that surrounded homosexuals within the UK during the 80s. Another secondary resource I wanted to look at surrounding the idea about the public opinion on Bent was a review of the performance. Again, unfortunately I couldn't locate any British reviews, thus another American resource had to suffice. Yet, looking at other American reviews, they all seem to share a similar opinion. Alvin Goldfarb, the reviewer in question, highlights that Sherman's writing of Nazis is cliché and that they are consistently psychopathic, so perhaps the British audience, a viewer might be bored of a replaying stereotype. Overall, his opinion of the writing is fairly negative, yet he goes on to mention that many critics have also agreed that Bent is praiseworthy because of its positive portrayal of homosexuals. This could be interpreted that during the performance, the audience may have their negative opinions surrounding homosexuals to change into positive ones instead. However, Goldfarb concludes with Martin Sherman's Bent is the wrong vehicle for raising Broadway patrons' consciousness. What fascinates me about this is the fact that he focuses on the monetary value that this play could produce. Consequently, one could interpret that perhaps this is a reason as to why there are so many advertisements within the program, as the general reception of the play isn't either completely positive or negative. One can assume then that it is a financial risk putting on this show. In trying to discover a more local reason as to why these adverts are included within the Bent program, I proceeded to research what the financial impact was on most theatres in Britain during the 80s, since as I have just mentioned, it could be a financial risk to put on this performance. Wikipedia claims that the Conservative government during the 80s attacked the Arts Council of Great Britain for being politically biased, and consequently capped the government grant to the council. Therefore, one may assume that the Northcott during the 80s was forced to find local sponsors regardless of the content of the performance in order to maintain financial stability for the theatre. In conclusion, one must ask the question, does it actually matter about the style and content of the programmes? As for Bent, as there is no direct resource correlated to the Northcott's perspective of the programme and performance, it is hard to truly know their opinion. Yet if we use Postlethwaite's ninth crux, the codes, discourses, values, and the cultural systems of the historian's own time that shape understanding, essentially translating to comparing our current moral mode of thought with the past, we can perceive that my initial impression is a subjective presumption as to how controversial this performance is. For instance, if a new performance of Bent was put on at the Northcott and the programmes for it contained adverts in an insensitive style, just like the 80s version, the reaction could be more prevalent across the country, judging how easy it is to communicate news through media. Therefore, it is reasonable to create a programme with sensitivity to the content of the performance at hand.
I looked at the programme for the Dick Whittington pantomime performed 9th of December 1998 up until 16th of January 1999, put together by John Crocker at the Northcott Theatre. Dick Whittington is a well-known pantomime aimed at an intergenerational audience, which is highlighted by the content of adverts and children's puzzles relating to the story included within the programme. Dick Whittington has been listed as the staple of British pantomime since the 19th century, loosely based on a true story of how Richard Whittington, 1354 to 1423, was a rich merchant who was made Lord Mayor of London 3 times. I found the programme had a lack of focus on the pantomime itself, thus the programme gave me the impression it was used more as a way of including advertisements and promoting businesses in the local area, rather than focusing on the content of the pantomime. From looking at the programme, I found that adverts were included at the beginning, middle and end of the programme, using that as a basis of text, and then information regarding the performance was slotted in between. I found that the main body of text was the advertisements rather than the pantomime itself. The advertisements included are also particularly relevant to the target audience. John O'Brien stated that by early 20th century, the harlequinade had disappeared and pantomime became cast largely as Christmas entertainment aimed at children. Pantomime was an essential part of British theatre. As a result of this, it presumably became a tradition for the locals surrounding the Northcote Theatre to bring their children and other family members to watch the pantomimes. This is seen through the choice of adverts included, for example related to the local schools and to bike sales down by the quay, etc., suggesting that people from the local community come to watch the performance considering the style of the programme. As previously stated, I found that there was very little detail on the pantomime itself within the programme. However, I found it included games for children related to the pantomime. For example, Dick's word search, perhaps in order to engage the target audience with the storyline and content within the production. John O'Brien stated that pantomime stands as an example of popular neoclassicism, a mode of performance intended to bring classical stories and motifs to audiences who would not be able to encounter them in other media. We don't know whether this was the first production of Dick Whittington at the Northcote Theatre. We know that there was a second production after this one, which was performed in 2005 and at the beginning of 2006, but this may have been the first production of Dick Whittington in the local area. Thus, children would not have been exposed to the story and messages within the classical tale before necessarily. The use of children's puzzles related to the pantomime tale helps the target audience of young children in particular get to grips with what they are about to watch prior to the actual event. It's important to note that we are unable to make precise conclusions about why the content of the programme and particular adverts were included, as we don't know who produced the programme, i.e. who is involved in the printing and what content goes into it. Therefore, conclusions that have been made can only be based on the little evidence that we are provided with. Thomas Postlethwaite's second crux said that the encompassing conditions that directly and indirectly contributed to the events manifest identity and intelligibility. We need to understand the contextual matters, such as how many of the programmes were sold, how successful was the production, was this the first production of Dick Whittington at the Northcote Theatre, and what were the financial conditions of the Exeter residents at this time in history. This may in fact influence the content of the programme. For example, were certain local businesses chosen to be advertised because they were in need of a financial gain? As we are not provided with this information, we cannot make any final conclusions regarding these questions. In terms of graphological features, it can be noticed that the first 2 pages and the last 2 pages of the programme are printed in colour and the rest is in black and white, perhaps to entice the audience to buy it initially. As it's aimed at an intergenerational audience, the programme was perhaps used more as an advertising brochure rather than an information leaflet regarding the pantomime itself, considering the broad audience. Considering historically pantomimes are viewed as a Christmas tradition, the lack of focus on the performance demonstrates the event is more important than the actual content within the pantomime itself. Backed up by John O'Brien's point, who argued that the style of pantomimes relied on the spectacle, costumes, special effects and scenery as a way of providing entertainment. Thus, the actual storyline and text is perhaps viewed as secondary to this. To conclude, the programme contains more information relevant to a local audience rather than the content of the pantomime itself. Thus, the perspective of the performance is changed as a result of the style of the programme.